Hi, welcome to the next lecture in the Existentialism class, Philosophy 3511. This one's entitled Condemned to be Free. In earlier lectures, we've been looking at mostly literary types after getting through the early and Middle Age influences from both philosophical and religious figures. We've been looking at mostly modern and near contemporary literary figures, and they've been able to show us, among other things, how things might be said with language that is not strictly denotative in order to evoke what we now understand to be an existential sense that can't, most would contend, be expressed in a straightforward type of philosophical description. And then most recently we've seen a couple of philosophers, both German, start to try to spell that out. But even when they do, they have to start using language in ways that most philosophers find unacceptable, either by coining new terms or by using regular terms in ways that speakers of, in this case, German, wouldn't recognize. And so cheating in some way, you might say. The figures that we're looking on from here on are also a combination thereof, but now the focus is shifting from Germany over to France. And the figure who is most prominent during this time, arguably most prominent in the 20th century, is a man by the name of Jean-Paul Sartre. And he lived from 1905 to 1980. And he was both a philosopher and a novelist. Wrote some short stories as well, a couple plays, and was also politically active. So there are people who straddle these two ways of writing, so that they're writing fiction to do the things that these other writers have shown us is necessary to get this sense across, and are also writing for a well-educated 20th century crowd who are steeped in European philosophy, and so are able to appreciate these notions in what many might call a non-fictional form. Now, Sartre was born in Paris, and he was the only child that his parents had. And his father, while overseas when Sartre was just 2 years old, died, leaving his mother to take care of him for the rest of his life. And she moved in with relatives who helped to take care of him when he was a little boy. One of those relatives, though, was a first cousin of Sartre's mom, a man named Albert Schweitzer, who, despite the German name, considered himself French. He's from Alsace-Lorraine, the area just between, right on the edge between France and Germany. It had gone back and forth between being French and German at various times. But what's interesting about this is he is himself a philosopher and theologian who won the Nobel Prize for a book entitled Reverence for Life, and said there that ethics is nothing other than reverence for life. Reverence for life affords me my fundamental principle of morality, namely that good consists in maintaining, assisting, and enhancing life, and to destroy, to harm or hinder life is evil. So in one sense, besides being a prominent figure, he's also an early influence on the kind of thinking Sartre would have, because while I might often look to God for guidance, in a typical Judeo-Christian sense, I'm looking elsewhere. And as we've seen with the existentialists, it's not to somewhere else that I should look, but to myself. And whether I picture that self as having, as Tolstoy would have said, the kingdom of God within me, or simply turning back on myself with the kind of responsibility that Socrates was famous for, this relation actually played a role in Sartre's early development. Now here's a picture of Jean-Paul when he was young. and about the age of 12, his mother remarried and moved to La Rochelle, that is away from Paris. And he was bullied a lot as a kid. He was, like many intellectual types, not able to handle the sort of school ground encounters that he found there. And his recourse was to go into the library, and he was a huge fan already as a young boy, even, of classical literature. So he'd done a lot of reading, but that was almost completely in literature. In his late teens, he became attracted to philosophy through the writings of another French philosopher named Henri Bergson. Bergson, who was a prominent figure in the first half of the 20th century, less so today, is also a Nobel Prize winner. And the work that interested Sartre was a book that Bergson wrote called Time and Free Will, an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. And part of what appealed to Sartre was the idea of intuition. In most of his writings, Sartre has a kind of dualism very much like the Cartesian tradition, where he thinks of the self as, in a way, free of physical causation. And so this book by Bergson got Sartre very interested in the study of philosophy, since it dealt with issues that he was more concerned with than typical the religion he'd been brought up in. So because of that, Sartre returned to Paris, and he started studying at a private school and earned certificates in psychology, the history of philosophy, logic, ethics, sociology, and physics. And because of that, he was able to study at the École Normale Supérieure, which is the door of which I have pictured here, and have it for a number of reasons, because it's very prominent in French intellectual history, and a school at which people would be in contact with all of the great writers and thinkers of that time. However, the most prominent figure in his life that he met at that time was Simone de Beauvoir, a fellow student, and one of the few women studying philosophy at the time. Once the two met, they became lifelong companions, and the details of their relationship are intricate, let's say, and we'll be coming back to this in the next lecture. But not only did they form an initial romantic relationship, they were competitors of a sort, since they were both members in the same school. And the first time Sartre took his exam to become a college instructor, he failed it. When he took it the second time, he virtually tied for first place with Simone de Beauvoir. And although he was eventually awarded the first place in his class and her second, and of course we'll spell out what significance that might have when we get to the lecture on her, nonetheless, their relationship lasted the entirety of his life. And few things had a greater influence on him than that relationship, for reasons we'll see. However, in the 1930s, a Second World War had broken out in Europe, and Sartre was drafted into the French army, and he served there as a meteorologist. Up until that time, he had been, like many of the people in Paris, studying the work of Hegel. There was a revival of Hegelianism, and Sartre was one of the people taken up in it. And if you remember Hegel, there's a sense in which history is the unfolding of world spirit, or Geist. And this notion was very romantic at the time, especially among a younger crowd. And so Sartre had gotten taken up in it, but when he got into the service, he was, after a short time in it, actually, maybe a year, taken prisoner. He was captured in a town in eastern France, and he was held as a prisoner of war. And when he was there, he actually did a lot of reading and writing. He began, among other things, to read Heidegger. He read Heidegger's Being and Time and sort of refashioned, in ways that Heidegger explains in one of his books, refashioned his Hegelian thinking to be more in line with what Heidegger was saying about Dasein in our last lecture, so that this unfolding of history becomes something much more like a disclosure of human significance as Dasein. Now, what Sartre's thinking here at this time, of course, he doesn't know just what's going to happen during the war, whether he'll survive it, etc. But he begins to take issues like the morality of war seriously. In other words, whose responsibility is it? If a soldier is serving in a war, could he simply say, and now she simply say, that I was commanded to do a certain thing, and so I did it? Could one simply turn one's back on a problem in the world and say, well, it's not happening here, so it's none of my business? Those sorts of ethical concerns. And if one is in the war, can one ever think that something's wrong and then take it upon oneself to do or not do something in response, even though one has been ordered something to do something to the contrary? And so these sorts of issues of responsibility really start to come to the fore when one is placed in both the prisoner of war camp that he was in, as well as just sort of the general ambiance of Europe at the time, where many cities are being destroyed, and people are having to come to grips with radically different situations than they're used to. As history would have it, though, Sartre did survive the war. He was released just a year later in the spring of 1941, and given civilian status, he was able to get his teaching position back at a lycée, a high school near Paris, and settled in a hotel. He grew fond of living in hotels. He, for reasons we'll get to, he seemed to like what you might call anonymity of it, that one could always try something new without being conditioned by one's surroundings. So hotel rooms were tenuous in that they didn't have a hold on one's behavior, and so he spent a great deal of his life living in hotels. He was given a position at a different lycée in Paris shortly after that, and when he got back, he helped to found a group called Socialism and Liberty with a few other people, including Simone de Beauvoir, a man named Merleau-Ponty, who was very active at the time, and they all got together and tried to create more of an active resistance, but not with a great deal of success, at least not initially. The picture I have here shows these journalists meeting with General Marshall. This is actually in the Pentagon at the end of the war in 1945. And Sartre would continue to have these sorts of political inclinations all his life, because for him they had philosophical significance as well. Because one of the things that the war would do to someone of this type would be to make them think about the kinds of responsibilities one has when faced with the sort of situation that the French in particular were vis-a-vis the Nazis. However, while the politics wasn't getting very far, at that time he started to produce some of his best writings. In 1938, he published a book which in English would just be Nausea. And in it, he tells the story of a character who is trying to reconcile himself with a failed relationship. And he's creates a combination of literature and philosophy. Normally, when philosophers write fiction, it doesn't go very well. And when literary types try writing philosophical essays, they're usually not what philosophers call rigorous enough. But this is a nice combination in that it gives us a story in the normal sense of the term, but because of the nature of the subject, it really gets at what Sartre is suggesting is an existential nausea. That is, the character in the book literally gets sick in a way that some people are familiar with. If we, say, eat something bad or experience motion sickness, we know what it's like to have sort of a genuine ill-at-ease feeling. And so he uses that to convey one's encounter with existence. There's one scene, for example, where the main character is looking at the roots of a tree, and their involvement, and here one could think of something like the Cartesian tree of physics stuck in the ground of metaphysics to kind of get this idea across. The character just kind of gets nauseous at the involvement of the tree in the ground, and the sense that we have when we feel that way, of there not being any real stability. One of the things about, say, motion sickness is we can't ever quite settle down and get our bearings, and grow queasy as a result. And so he starts using that same sense of queasiness in this story to try to convey a sense of existential anxiety and that kind of thing. One of the characters in the book, not the main character, but one of the characters he calls the self-taught man, or the autodidact. And this person is almost a parody of the philosopher, in that the character spends all day at the library and has decided that he's going to read everything in the library and thereby educate himself. And so he starts at the letter A and works his way through, but around the time he gets to the letter S, which some people say stands for Sartre, some people say stands for socialism, he dies. In other words, you want to read everything from A to Z, but life just isn't long enough. And so you spent your time, again, a critique of the intellectual, you spent your time sort of absorbing all this information but never really did anything. And so one of the things Sartre's having to wrestle with, because it is somewhat autobiographical, is how much time should one devote to the theoretical? How much time should one devote to the actual or the practical, that is, the political? Especially in times of war, one can see that book learning, valuable though it may be, really kind of misses the point if it doesn't wind up producing some sort of beneficial action. And so the criticism here in this first work is how one deals with the nauseating sensations that a meaningless existence can produce, and whether one should turn to the library, so to speak, the ivory tower, or whether one should go out and engage, and that term engagement has a great deal of meaning for Sartre, whether one should engage in politics, that is, trying to better the human condition without too much worry about its theoretical underpinnings, which may always have to come after the fact. So in the book, we have a physical expression of psychological unease or existential angst represented as nausea. And it's actually inanimate objects that seem to encroach on the main character, Rakitan's, ability to define himself. That is, on his intellectual and spiritual freedom. when he meets the self-taught man that I just mentioned, um, this character who spends all his time reading alphabetically admits to Rokotan that he's a socialist, or that is, he confides that to him. And what's interesting, one could even say hilarious about it, is to what degree can one be a socialist, or be in anything for that matter, but especially something like a socialist whose concerns are for the betterment of people, if one spends all of one's days holed up in a library. So one can theoretically be anything, and this is part of the jab at theoretical knowledge. One can claim or theoretically be hold any position, but if one doesn't actually get out and do something, to what extent could one claim to be, in this case, a socialist? And in trying to show how the novel does that or handles that type of duality, in a later work entitled What is Literature, Sartre says, on the one hand, the literary object has no substance but the reader's subjectivity. But on the other hand, the words are there, like traps to arouse our feelings and to reflect them towards us. Thus the writer appeals to the reader's freedom to collaborate in the production of the work. Now, in part what he means is a good book forces us to think, but it also makes the work a participatory thing for the person. One of the joys of reading is, of course, that we get to go along, but in works that are of greater philosophical content, more work is required on the part of the reader, but that very thing can actually engage them because they have to think more or work harder. In the same way, if you're writing a book, and this is just the beginning of them for Sartre, where you're thinking about political engagement, you can actually engage the minds, or what he's here calling the freedom, of other subjectivities, and convince them to vie for your side. And of course, that's one of the reasons that Plato and the tradition following him disliked literary or emotive uses of language, because they could get us to feel and think things that weren't necessarily the case. They were persuasive. And what Sartre's showing here is that that can be of enormous political value if used properly. In other words, that art, perhaps much more so than philosophy, can actually promote certain ideas and ideals and can actually motivate people to action. It's very rare that one reads a philosophical treatise and feels like running out in the streets to correct some wrong or right some injustice. And the difference lies in the fact that literature will put a human face on it and make it an actual story that someone's experiencing, rather than just sort of a general conveyance of the idea. The next of Sartre's important works is called The Wall. It's a short story. It was published as a book of short stories, 5 of them, in 1939. And The Wall is a story about a situation in which prisoners are condemned to death. And it was written around the time that Sartre goes into the army. The story, though, is set in the Spanish Civil War, which began just before that. It started in 36 and ended around the time he wrote it in 39. And in that war, the nationalists, led by General Franco, overcame the forces of the Spanish Republic and to take over Spain. But the title refers to the wall used by firing squads when they execute prisoners. And the wall is meant to symbolize the inevitability of one's own death and not knowing when it's coming in general. If you remember back from Dostoevsky, he actually faced such a firing squad, and then when the sentence wasn't carried out, there's suddenly this sense of a new lease on life. However, one knows that the wall is still there. While I'm not going to be executed today and should make as much of every day as a result, the wall's still there. I'm up against it at some point. And that's kind of what Heidegger meant with this sense of being towards death. We are always already sort of taking our own mortality into consideration when we do things. And so the protagonists in this book, along with two others in the same cell, have been sentenced to death. And he's offered a way out if he reveals the location of a comrade of his. This main character refuses to cooperate until just before his scheduled execution, when, seeing no harm in it, he gives the authorities what he believes to be false information. However, it turns out that the person that he gives the information about has moved from his previous hiding place to the very spot where this character says that he would be. So the person that he gives the information about is shot. And although the main character in the book's life is spared, his name is Pablo, he has to live, of course, with the guilt of having caused this person's death. Now, he didn't intend to do it. He thought he was giving false information to save his own neck. But part of it, of course, is the contingencies that exist out there. And again, just like in the last book, life isn't a theoretical thing, a puzzle to be solved theoretically. There are lots of contingencies that make life the actual thing we know it to be, the incalculable mystery that make it the both wonderful and terrible thing that it is. And this idea of this impending doom, because they know exactly when their execution is going to be, they pee on themselves, they can't control themselves. He's trying to show us how self-absorbed we get as the proximity of our own death looms nearer. And so how much ethics and morality and our concern for others get thrown out when push comes to shove. Now the next major work is a play. Sartre, in addition to writing novels and short stories, wrote a number of plays, and two are contained here. In the picture that I have here, it's got what for English speakers is the title No Exit from 1944. Its French title was Huis Clos, Huisclos, and it's something like the French term, a French equivalent for the English term in camera, which would refer to something like a private discussion behind closed doors. So sometimes you'll see English translations that say just that, in camera, no way out, behind closed doors, etc. Most of the time you'll see it translated as no exit. The other one here is Les Mouches, which is the flies. And in this play, in the play No Exit, it's a depiction of an afterlife in which three deceased characters are punished by being locked in a room together for all eternity. The three characters are a coward, a sadist, and it's depicted as a baby killer. And it's their judgments of each other that most interests Sartre, because in one sense their condemnation by each other is this eternal hell that he's trying to represent. And so this is actually the source of one of his more famous quotations, L'enfer c'est les autres, which is hell is other people, or hell is others. And one of the things he's claiming here is that we may have all what we think are justifications for our behaviors, but other people are going to view us from outside. They won't get those. And so we'll simply be called a coward, a baby killer, or something like that. And our essence, so to speak, will be summed up by their interpretation of our actions. And so one of what makes that hell, so to speak, is that we're not in control of that. We're being objectified by other people, and we're so used to thinking of ourselves as subjects in the sense of the locus of action, the place from which we know ourselves. And so when other people sum us up, for good or bad, but especially for bad, then they're taking away that privileged position. We were the ones that were going to decide who we are. And now these other people are foisting their labels on us and summing us up. And in one sense, forcing us to be that thing in many cases, because we appropriate to one extent or another, even just by reacting to them, the labels that they put on us. So Sartre uses this expression, the dialectic of intersubjectivity, to describe how the world is altered upon the appearance of another person, of how the world then appears oriented to the other person and not to the self. However, the appearance of the other occurs as a phenomenon in the life of the person and not as a radical threat to the existence of self. Because as you've experienced yourself, you can realize that other people perceive you as an object. You're being, so to speak, objectified by those other people. In English, we normally only hear that when it has to do with sex or gender. I don't want to be objectified in that way, or turned into an object. But here he's talking about it in a broader sense, where a subject has to understand that for others, he or she is an object necessarily, that for them, you are something they encounter in their world. However, the flip side, as I just mentioned, is that you're doing the same to them. And so while there's this dialectic of intersubjectivity, that is, of various subjectivities, in the end, that can be our salvation, so to speak. We can be a hell for each other, but once we recognize that there is a subject there who can't so easily be summed up, or maybe shouldn't be so easily summed up by this one expression, this one term, then we can have more empathy for people and realize there's probably more to that person than just that description. Now, chronologically, that brings us to Sartre's largest work, and this one in philosophy, but I'm glossing over many other works. In one sense, it's hard to believe the sheer volume of writing, especially during the time that a war was going on, that he produced. And this is part of the reason for the reputation for endless cigarettes and coffee. But in 1943, he published Being and Nothingness, a phenomenological essay on ontology. Sartre's purpose here was to assert the individual's existence as prior to the individual's essence, and I'll come back to what he means by that. But his main concern in writing the book was to demonstrate that free will does exist, and so he uses the term being more or less the way Heidegger did, though he changes Dasein from being just a being to something that introduces nothingness into the world, and he's using nothingness radically differently. And because of the difference, Heidegger really wanted nothing to do with Sartre's use of these terms. For simplicity's sake, if you think of being as a solid mass, and think of consciousness as something like the cutting away of bits, almost like a sculptor would of stone, to get something out of it. He's using something like a Cartesian or a Kantian conception of consciousness as that which divides the world up into things, into what Heidegger had called beings. And so we introduce sort of what Sartre will call negation into the world, and in so doing generate these questions about purpose and whatnot. And so while his work is influenced by Heidegger, Sartre's profoundly skeptical of any idea that humanity might achieve a kind of state of personal fulfillment comparable to Heidegger's notion that we could have a re-encounter with being. If you remember, Heidegger thinks that Dasein discloses being, and in so doing gets something like salvation, or fulfillment, because that's the most authentic thing that Dasein can do. In that way, Heidegger is doing ontotheology, and as I had said before, kind of replacing God with being, so that while there isn't anything like the Christian notion of salvation, just the fact that one knows that one is being, or that one is disclosing being, is a fulfilling project. It puts one at one with being. And that's sort of the goal that one would have in a Christian way of thinking, where one sought reunification with God. Sartre doesn't buy any of that. In his account, man is a creature that's haunted by this vision of what he calls completion. And so what he means is a being that causes itself. And of course, that's the role that God always played. Born into a material reality, especially including one's own body, people find themselves inserted into being. But unlike Heidegger, he doesn't think of us as being, how to put this, he doesn't think of us as being the same kind of thing as being with a capital B. Consciousness for Sartre is still the kind of traditional notion of individuality or subjectivity. So consciousness has the ability to conceptualize possibilities and to make them appear, right, to bring things about, or to annihilate them. And that's where this notion of negation comes in, to say no. And of course, that's part of that has to do with the ethics of turning away from certain things, one's responsibility or complicity in the war, etc. And so this very long work is an attempt to elucidate in philosophical jargon the relation between being and nothingness, or between a material world and a seemingly non-material or non-physical subjectivity or consciousness. Now, just a short time after that, Sartre releases the first of a series of novels that have wound up producing a trilogy. There was an intended fourth book, which never got finished. But the first of them was The Age of Reason, and another book called Troubled Sleep, and obviously the English titles, Iron in the Soul, and then the fourth book was meant to be The Last Chance, and this was all part of what he called the Roads to Freedom. And so in this first novel, The Age of Reason, which, like all the rest, is about a character named Matthew, who is a socialist teacher of philosophy. So in one sense, it's extremely autobiographical in nature. In this first novel, it's set in Paris in the late 30s and focuses on 3 days in the life of this philosophy teacher. And in this one, he's trying to get the money to pay for an abortion for his mistress. And Sartre uses the motivations of various characters to try to get this sense, as I was saying before, about how one person's subjectivity can be objectified by another. And here he's concerned, above all, to show that freedom is something like the ultimate aim of human existence, that what we're shooting for, and while he's argued that there is such a thing as free will, he seems to always suggest that it requires that we do it, that it isn't just a given, so to speak. And so in this book, he uses the character to illustrate the existentialist notion that Any ultimate freedom is something that can't be taken away from the person. In other words, I could be killed, and this goes back to the Socratic notion. I could be killed by someone, but I'm free to say no to something, even if my execution would result from that. So he's trying to make a case for the ultimate freedom of the individual will. Very often, almost like in Kant's philosophy, we want to say we do everything out of inclination. But as Kant had said, the good will is the only truly good thing in the world. And Sartre is doing something like this by saying freedom is something that, even though sometimes it's hard to accept, is something that is inalienable. That is, it can't be taken away from someone because it is the very nature of their choosing. And so here in this series of novels, he's trying in one sense to display in a fictional form or a semi-fictional form the ideas that he had just spelled out in, let's say, nauseating detail in Being and Nothingness. Now, the very next year, Sartre is back to publishing nonfiction or philosophy. And I say back, there's a constant writing of in basically all mediums. He's writing critical essays and reviews and novels and philosophical works. But the next year, Existentialism is a Humanism was published. Sometimes you'll see this in English as Existentialism and Humanism, but really the point he's getting at, and it's said here in French, is that existentialism is not the, let's say, atheistic, uncaring ideology that it's often portrayed as. Sartre is trying to say this is basically a kind of humanism, and to his way of thinking, the most human of humanisms, because it turns everything back on people. If you remember, around the time of the Renaissance, we had gone from thinking that our salvation is going to come from God to an appreciation for earthly things. We have that now, except with the denial of God that people like Sartre are making. All of the responsibility goes back on people, so that while we may think of it as, say, atheists as disparaging something good, they are saying something like, the goodness was always something we had to supply. Now we're just honestly doing so and recognizing the responsibility that's being placed on ourselves. So in this work, Sartre asserts what he thinks is the key defining concept of existentialism, and that is that existence of a person is prior to his or her essence. And the term existence precedes essence becomes a maxim. Since it's so short, it represents the existentialist movement generally. What Sartre's thinking is that this means there's nothing to dictate a person's character, their goals in life, and so on. Only the individual can do that. And so if you think of people like the Stoics or Descartes, who somehow think, who have a sense of a radical dualism, where I'm completely in control of my own mind or my own self. You have a sense of what Sartre's claiming here. As he says, man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. So, contrary to Plato, who thought there had to be thought and then action, what Sartre is saying is there's action, and then we sort of adapt to that. We decide which things we want to keep doing, which we don't, and take on responsibility for ourselves. And so here he thinks of things like anguish as a type of emotion that people feel and kind of think that I'm not doing what I ought to. Aristotle had a similar claim about regret. Whereas in Aristotle's thinking, regret shows that we're not being as good a rational animal as we might or we think we should. For Sartre, anguish isn't living up to an ideal or a potentiality. That's not already set. Anguish is when we're not doing what we want to do, part of which is the very setting of our possibilities or potentials. So he uses an expression that in English would be being for oneself or itself to, as he would put it, sort of embrace freedom and take meaningful action toward achieving some goal. He's trying to express that the responsibility lies with us, and uses the term abandonment as something like the loneliness that atheists feel when they realize there's no God, in the way that people might realize that their parents can't save them. That we're abandoned to being alone in the universe, and so we have to be the ones who establish the essence of our lives. And so rather than being the cheap cop-out that some people think of it as, or as being thoroughly nihilistic, Sartre's trying to say, no, this is where our humanity really begins. We have to take the bull by the horn, so to speak, and do the things that we want to be representative of us, especially of us to ourselves as subjects. And one writer has put it this way, a man named Michael Romer, in his book Telling Stories. He says, what is meant by the saying that existence precedes essence? It means that first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives of him, is indefinable, it's only because he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he will have made what he will be. And so in one sense, Sartre is saying the same kind of thing that Nietzsche and other existentialists are saying, is that it's up to us to become the person that we will be or will have been. So that when we arrive, existence comes first, then our essence is made. And so when we looked at the Aristotelian notion called essentialism, what Sartre is doing here is explicitly turning the thing around. The Aristotelian tradition has it that our essence is given at the outset, and we are biologically determined to be this kind of entity, and we go through the steps doing a more or less better job than our contemporaries, hopefully. And so what Sartre is saying, by contrast, is that we can be anything we want to be. Now, you can see why people who agree with Aristotle would say, well, I don't know that you can be just anything you want to be. The parameters are largely set by the kind of organism you are. But Sartre has a different notion of the self, because unlike Aristotle, he's not thinking in the holistic terms of us being an animal with mind being a function of the body, but more in the Cartesian sense of the mind or soul as being distinct in kind from the body. And so what Sartre is saying is that we're being falsely constrained by the thought that there's only a certain limited amount of things that people can do, and we're just trying to reinvent the wheel with a slightly different spin. Instead, we are radically free at any time to do whatever we like or don't. That is, to not do what we don't like. Now, here's a picture of Sartre in the middle of his life, and it's in his office, but it's a library-like setting where the intellectual is writing away all day long, and here famously smoking his pipe. And in the earlier story, we saw that there's this self-criticism in a sense of being too much of an isolationist and being a socialist, for example, in word only. and not actually being involved with people. And so around this time, after the Second World War, when the Cold War begins, he's starting to, like most people, see a distinction of blocks of communists and capitalists. And of course, being in Europe, he's traditionally in a capitalist area, but there's a great deal of sympathy for communism at the time, which is seen as something like extreme democracy, because as Marx had pointed out, the workers don't have control of the means of production, and so as a result are necessarily shortchanged. And so Sartre at this time thinks that it's part of an intellectual's job to become politically engaged. So he, at the time, embraced Marxism. He didn't join the Communist Party, but while he was a Marxist, he attacked what he thought of as human rights abuses, particularly in the Soviet Union. One of the first French journalists to expose the existence of the labor camps, and he was opposed to the invasion of Hungary, Russian anti-Semitism, and the execution of dissidents. So while criticizing a country like Russia, he can also see that his own country, France, is doing something similar in North Africa and Algeria. And so he exposes the use of torture in concentration camps by the French, and becomes a supporter of the Algerians in their fight for liberation. And he signed at the time what was called the Manifesto of the 121. And as a result of that, he became a target for what was called the Organization of the Secret Army, and escaped 2 bomb attacks in the early 60s. So in one sense, he's getting more literally involved by denouncing various practices and whatnot, but his thinking at this time, in anywhere from, say, the late 40s through the 60s, becomes much more politically engaged. As a result, he began to write books that were much more political in nature, and one of the more famous is called The Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 1960. It's actually a follow-up to a book that he had written 2 or 3 years earlier called Search for Method. In that earlier work, he had wanted to do something like develop what he thought of as an existential Marxism. In other words, you have sort of the political ideology spelled out by Marx, alienation of labor and all of the things that bolstered communism in the early days. And what Sartre was trying to do was sort of make an existential version of that in the earlier book. Here in 1960, after the death of Stalin, he writes the Critique of Dialectical Reason in order to give Marxism a more vigorous intellectual defense. He felt that a lot of people were simply thinking of it as a godless ideology, and he wanted to sort of spell out Marx's notion of class in a way that would be more appealing to intellectuals at the time. So his emphasis on the humanist values in the early works of Marx led to a lot of people at the time disputing sort of the nature of Marxism and its intent and whatnot. And so from this point on, Sartre realizes that in one sense, if one's to be an existentialist, one has to walk the walk. One actually has to get engaged. And of course, one can see how certain existentialists had thought, no, the emphasis has to just be on me, because I can never really control what's going on out there. I'm never in charge of how other people view me, even. So I'm just going to, as Kierkegaard had done, focus on myself. With Sartre, you're starting to see an acknowledgement of others who start out being the hell that he had suggested, but who, because of this sort of shared situation, we're all in this hell together, become the circumstances, that is, these other people become the circumstances we appropriate in creating an identity for ourselves. And so starts beginning to see Marxism as the responsibility that we have to ourselves and one another to make a better world for ourselves, that the responsibility does not and cannot lie anywhere else. Now what that led to, oddly enough, was him taking a completely different view of literature itself by the time he reached his older years. A lot of people find, Darwin did, for example, that as they get older, fiction, even literature, seems less interesting than nonfiction, than things that are actually about the real world. And by the early 60s, after seeing all these political issues going on and having to fight about real-world problems, Sartre ended up renouncing literature in a book called The Words in English. And in it, he sort of gives an account of the early part of his life and fascination with it, that is, with literature. And one of his primary reasons for writing it at this time was the celebrity of a French writer named Marcel Proust. Proust had written an enormous work, which in English you'll see translated as either In Search of Lost Time or Remembrance of Things Past, published in 7 parts from 1913 to 1927. And what bothered Sartre was probably envy as much as anything, but prompting him to write this book in denouncing literature, it made for a great articulation of Sartre's own position about the nature of existentialism, and it goes something like this. If I were an Aristotelian, I would think that being a human being, I always have the potential to do human things. So since writing books is something people can potentially do, I could always do that, and anything else that's available to humans. Now, this notion, and it goes back to the Greeks, of potential, we often use in day-to-day experiences. I didn't do it, but I could have done it. And in order to push home his existentialist notion that existence precedes essence, Sartre is saying something like this. The genius of Proust, because he uses Proust as the example, the genius of Proust is in what he actually wrote. There are no books that Proust could have written. There are only the books that Proust did write. And in saying that, he means there are not any deeds that you and I could have done. At the end of our life, for us to say that we could have, the coulda, woulda, shoulda stuff, is nonsensical. And it's a sort of betrayal of, or a dishonesty about the nature of life. We can only ever do what we actually do. In one sense, talk of conditionals, of what might have been the case, etc., is a form of dishonesty. There only ever is what we actually do. And so Sartre is using the example of Proust to sort of spell that out, and is saying as much even about his own writings. Now, even though he had reached this understanding of literature as no longer a worthy endeavor, just the next year in 1964 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, but he declined it. He was the first Nobel laureate to voluntarily decline the prize, and is only one of 2 today who's ever done so. but he refused it, saying that he always declined official honors. He was awarded the Legion of Honor in 1945, and it turned that down as well. But when he got the prize in 1964, he said, "A writer," there's a quote, "a writer should not allow himself to be turned into an institution." However, according to one of the Nobel Committee members, he later asked for the $53,000 prize money, but he was turned down. So you don't accept the honor, you don't get the money either. And here's a picture of Sartre just a couple years after winning the Nobel Prize in 1967. This is taken in Venice, Italy. And later, when asked, even later than this picture, when asked how he would like to be remembered, he said that, "I would like people to remember Nausea, and my two plays, No Exit, which we looked at, and another called The Devil and the Good Lord, and then my two philosophical works, more particularly the second one, Critique of Dialectical Reason, then my essay on Genet, that is Jean Genet, in a work that called Saint Genet. If these are remembered," he said, that would be quite an achievement, and I don't ask for more. As a man, if a certain Jean-Paul Sartre is remembered, I would like people to remember the milieu or historical situation in which I lived, how I lived in it, in terms of the aspirations which I tried to gather up within myself. And so in one sense, he's saying that's the kind of thing that sums up existentialism, and that is that one can only do the best in one's situation. One can't blame one's situation. That is simply how things are. The situation into, as Heidegger would put it, we are thrown. And so when one takes up those contingencies and appropriates them and makes them one's own, then one can only do the best that one can. But Sartre is still insisting that there's some kind of radical freedom that we have in the doing of that. Now, from that time on, Sartre's physical condition deteriorated. He was still active as an older person could be during the 70s, but his physical condition started to deteriorate, not just because of all the smoking. He had been a chain smoker all his life, but he had been using amphetamines in order to keep up the pace of his writing. He did a massive biography of Gustave Flaubert late in his life, that is, late in Sartre's life. And he suffered from hypertension, and at one point, he never had good sight. If you look at the photographs, you see he's got one wandering eye, but by the early to mid-70s, he was almost completely blind. He didn't die until the spring of 1980 from edema of the lung. So basically, the smoking is what got him. He didn't want to be buried near his mother and stepfather, so it was arranged that instead of being buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery, he would be buried at the cemetery at Montparnasse. And on the day of his funeral, you hear different conjectures, but at least 50,000 Parisians came down to the Boulevard Montparnasse to follow the cortege. The funeral started at, quote, the hospital at 2 p.m., then filed through the 14th arrondissement, past all Sartre's haunts, the places he used to hang out, and entered the cemetery through the gate on the Boulevard Edgar Quinet. And it says Sartre was initially buried in a temporary grave to the left of the cemetery gate. Now, if you see the picture you see here, it wasn't until 4 days later that his body was disinterred for cremation, and his ashes reburied at the permanent site. And it's hard to see in this slide, but he's buried with Simone de Beauvoir, that is, the ashes are, and her tale we'll be coming to in the next lecture.